It was a mission that should have been impossible. A handful of British agents deep in occupied France, daring to do what the entire Royal Air Force had failed to accomplish for months. The year was 1942. Hitler's war machine dominated Europe, and his air defenses were unmatched. German radar, the secret network of electronic eyes known as Freya and Würzburg, could see the skies long before Allied planes reached the coast. Every bomber raid was shredded before it began. If Britain wanted to turn the tide, those radar stations had to be blinded. But to destroy them, first someone had to understand them. And that meant capturing one. They called it Operation Biting, a name as sharp as the mission itself. It was not a conventional raid. It was a theft of knowledge, technology, and time. The kind of operation where one wrong step meant not just death, but failure on a scale that could cripple the entire Allied air campaign. For the men of the 1st Airborne Division, it would be a night that tested the very limits of courage. For the German defenders at Bruneval, it would be a nightmare that fell from the sky. Before we descend into that darkness, into the blinding snow, the static hum of German radar, and the heart-pounding chaos of one of the most daring raids of the Second World War, remember this: history remembers the wars we win, but rarely the missions that made victory possible. If you find power in the forgotten stories of World War II, the hidden operations, the sacrifices buried in classified reports, the men who fought in silence so others could fight in daylight, then take a moment to support this channel. Like, share, and subscribe, because together we're keeping these untold stories alive. The air war over Britain had been won, but only barely. The summer of 1940 had scorched the sky with dogfights, vapor trails and fire raining over London. And though the Luftwaffe had been driven back, no one in the Royal Air Force believed the threat was gone. It had only evolved. The Germans had learned from their failure. Now, instead of relying solely on bombers and luck, they were using something new, something invisible. Their radars could see through the clouds, through darkness, through the calm silence of the Channel. Every time British aircraft approached occupied Europe, the Germans were already waiting. To the pilots, it seemed like witchcraft. Squadrons flying at night would be ambushed out of nowhere. Reconnaissance planes vanished into the mist and never returned. But back in London, inside a cluster of nondescript brick buildings and blackout dim offices, scientists began to realize the truth. Germany had built a wall of invisible eyes stretching from Norway to the French coast. Radar, radio detection and ranging was no longer just a defensive tool. It was now the backbone of Nazi air dominance. The British knew radar. They had invented it first. The chain home stations along England's coast had given Fighter Command a critical edge during the Battle of Britain. But the Germans had refined the concept. Their radar, known by code names like Freya and Würzburg, was smaller, more precise, and frighteningly advanced. It could track individual aircraft at long range and guide anti-aircraft guns with surgical accuracy. The war had entered a new dimension, one of mathematics, frequencies, and electronics, where the outcome depended on who could listen more closely to the hum of the air. The problem was, no one in Britain knew exactly how German radar worked. The RAF had intercepted fragments of transmissions, blurry intelligence sketches, and the vague recollections of captured German technicians. But it wasn't enough. Every bombing raid that failed, every pilot lost to anti-aircraft fire, was another reminder that the Allies were fighting blind. Somewhere across the Channel, along the cliffs of Normandy, was the key. A full Würzburg radar array, intact and operational. If Britain could capture it, even in pieces, it could change everything. Inside the Air Ministry, the pressure was suffocating. Night bombers were being torn apart over France and the Low Countries. The RAF scientists at the Telecommunications Research Establishment, led by Dr. R.V. Jones, were desperate for answers. Jones, a wiry young physicist with the focus of a surgeon, became obsessed with radar intelligence. He spent nights poring over intercepted signals, sketching waveforms by candlelight, arguing with generals who thought the idea of stealing radar parts from occupied France was lunacy. But he was convinced, if they could get their hands on a Würzburg, they could decode its frequencies, develop countermeasures, and blind the Luftwaffe across the Channel. German operators sat in concrete bunkers, listening to the rhythm of their machines. To them, the radar's pulse was the heartbeat of control, a steady electronic thrum that meant security, vigilance, superiority. The Würzburg's dish rotated with mechanical grace, its beams sweeping across the sky. It could detect a single bomber 40 kilometers away. The operators smoked, joked quietly, confident that their position was unassailable. To them, radar was the silent guardian of the Reich. To Britain, it was the wall that had to fall. In early 1942, reconnaissance photos revealed something extraordinary. Perched on the French cliffs near a small coastal village called Bruneval was a perfectly positioned Würzburg installation, its circular dish glinting faintly under the winter sun. The location was ideal for the Germans. Elevated ground, clear line of sight over the Channel, and suicidal for anyone who dared attack it. Anti-aircraft guns ringed the perimeter. Wehrmacht patrols roamed the beach below. Nearby, the radar operators and technicians lived in fortified quarters. But for Dr. Jones, it was exactly what he had been waiting for. When he brought the plan to the Air Ministry, the room went silent. "You're suggesting," one officer said, "that we steal a radar from a German cliff and carry it back across the Channel?" Jones didn't flinch. "Not steal, sir," he replied. "Borrow thoroughly." The laughter that followed was thin, uneasy, but in that brief moment something changed. What had once sounded insane began to take shape as a tactical possibility. Britain had, by then, a small but elite force of paratroopers trained for behind-the-lines operations, the 1st Airborne Division. They were young, fast, and untested in combat. What they lacked in experience, they made up for in audacity. It would be their first major airborne raid of the war. A team of fewer than 120 men would be dropped by moonlight onto a frozen French cliff, dismantle the Würzburg radar under enemy fire, and escape by sea before dawn. The mission would last just a few hours, but if it failed, it could cost hundreds of future airmen their lives, and possibly expose Britain's growing airborne program to the enemy. For weeks, the British studied aerial photos, memorizing every trench, every bunker, every patch of coastal scrub. A life-size replica of the radar was secretly built in Scotland, so that engineers could practice disassembling it. Paratroopers rehearsed landings, demolitions, and close-quarters combat until every movement felt mechanical. Their commanding officer, Major John Frost, a calm, calculating leader with a soldier's instincts and a gambler's heart, understood the stakes. "We'll either make history," he told his men, "or disappear into it." Back in Bruneval, the German garrison saw nothing unusual. The sea was rough, the sky grey. The radar turned in its endless rotation, sending invisible waves across the Channel, waves that carried no warning of what was coming. For now, the cliff was quiet, but across that narrow strip of dark water, Britain was preparing to send its first lightning bolt of revenge into the heart of occupied Europe. It began in a quiet office that smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and wet wool. The kind of place where impossible ideas were born because no one sane would listen. Dr. R.V. Jones had come to the War Cabinet with a map, a photograph, and an obsession. Spread across the table was the aerial image of Bruneval, a patch of French coastline, a cliff scarred by gun emplacements, and at its center, a single round shadow, the Würzburg dish. Around it, German trucks, sandbag walls, and the delicate geometry of cables running into underground bunkers. It looked ordinary to anyone else. To Jones, it was gold. He explained that the radar's transmitter could reveal the exact frequencies the Luftwaffe used to track British bombers. If captured intact, it would allow British scientists to jam German air defenses and mislead their guns. But if the dish were destroyed instead of captured, all that knowledge would vanish into smoke. So he proposed something extraordinary, not a bombing raid, not sabotage, but theft. The general stared at him as if he'd gone mad. "You want us to send men across the channel," one of them said, "to unscrew a radar?" Jones nodded. "Yes, sir," carefully. The room went silent again. In that pause, somewhere between disbelief and grim admiration, the operation that would later be codenamed Biting was born. It would require absolute precision, a seamless collaboration between scientists, paratroopers, and sailors. Every branch of Britain's war machine would have to work as one for a single night on a single stretch of hostile ground. Major John Frost was chosen to lead the assault. At 30, he was already seasoned by campaigns in the Middle East. Calm, understated, with the kind of quiet authority that soldiers instinctively followed. He understood that this mission was more than an experiment. It was a statement. Britain was striking back, not with brute force, but with intellect sharpened to a blade's edge. His men, C Company of the 2nd Parachute Battalion, had never been tested in real combat, yet every one of them volunteered when they heard the plan. They were told little, just that they would drop by night, hit a target on the coast, and be home before dawn. The fewer who knew the full truth, the better. Secrecy wrapped the operation like fog. Training began in the Scottish Highlands, where the wind tore across the hills and the sea glimmered cold and grey. There, in isolation, the raiders rehearsed every movement until it felt like ritual. Engineers built a full-scale replica of the Würzburg radar, pieced together from sketches, spy reports, and intuition. The men crawled through mock trenches, learned to cut telephone wires, practiced dismantling the dish with wrenches and explosives. Every drill ended with an unspoken understanding. One mistake in France and no one would make it home. The raid's timing was built around a moon phase, just enough light to navigate by, but not enough for the Germans to see them coming. The paratroopers memorized their drop zones, small fields on the plateau above the cliffs, while Royal Navy commandos prepared the extraction route below. The plan was to land inland, assault the radar site, seize the equipment, and retreat down to the beach, where motor launches would be waiting. The entire mission had to be completed in less than 2 hours. If dawn broke before they were gone, German reinforcements from Le Havre would cut them to pieces. Frost studied the details obsessively. Every contour of the cliff, every guard rotation, every tide chart. When his intelligence officer noted that the Germans had floodlights overlooking the beach, Frost simply replied, "Then we move before they wake up." His calm was unnerving and contagious. In London, meanwhile, the scientists prepared special crates and diagrams for the radar components. Dr. Jones and his team worked out how to identify the power unit, the receiver, the parabolic reflector's core. They even designed lightweight harnesses so that paratroopers could carry the stolen machinery on their backs during the retreat. This was no ordinary raid. It was part science expedition, part suicide mission. Every layer of the plan depended on the next. If the paratroopers missed their drop zone, they'd land too far inland and be trapped. If they delayed too long at the radar, the Navy would have to abandon them. And if the Navy couldn't reach the beach because of weather or German patrols, the entire company would vanish into occupied France. There was no room for improvisation. And yet every man knew that improvisation would save them in the end. By early February 1942, the operation was ready. The weather was merciless. Snow over England, heavy seas in the Channel. But the forecast promised a brief window of calm. Frost's men assembled at the airfield in green jump smocks and maroon berets, faces blackened with grease. The sound of engines rolled across the tarmac. In one hangar, crates of explosives, silenced Sten guns and small demolition charges were laid out like instruments waiting for their symphony. Frost walked through his men, speaking quietly, offering no speeches. He didn't need to. They knew what was at stake. This wasn't a raid to destroy, it was a raid to steal, and that made it infinitely more dangerous. As the planes were loaded and the final briefings given, Dr. Jones stood by the runway, his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets, watching the paratroopers climb aboard. He would not be going with them. His war was fought in laboratories and signal rooms, but tonight his equations would live and die in flesh and blood. "Bring me something to study," he told Frost with a faint smile. Frost nodded once and climbed into the transport. The engines roared to life. One by one, the aircraft lifted into the night, vanishing into the thick winter clouds that hung over the channel. Below them, the dark waters stretched toward the French coast, where the radar dish still turned, oblivious, sending its pulse into the night air, a heartbeat about to be interrupted. In London, the War Cabinet waited for word that would not come until morning. Somewhere between sky and sea, the future of Britain's air war depended on a few dozen men falling through darkness. The night was brittle with cold. A pale, half-hidden moon floated above the channel, lighting the waves like broken glass. Inside the Whitley bombers droning toward France, the paratroopers sat shoulder to shoulder, their faces dimly lit by red cabin lamps. The engines vibrated through the metal floor, a constant growl that filled every heartbeat. No one spoke. Gloves creaked as men adjusted their gear, teeth clenched around cigarettes that burned down to filters untouched. Somewhere behind them, a radio crackled, then fell silent again. Major John Frost glanced at his watch. 00:45 hours. They were over the French coast now. Through the slit window beside him, he could just make out the faint white line of surf and the darker smudge of the cliffs beyond. Bruneval. "The target! Stand up!" the jumpmaster shouted. The men rose as one, hands gripping the cables above their heads. Parachutes heavy on their backs, weapons slung, boots thudding against the deck. The green light flickered on. Frost checked his watch again, drew one breath, and stepped into the freezing black. The sky exploded around them, not with gunfire, but with silence. The moment of falling was like being suspended between life and death. The wind tore at their faces, their clothes snapped against their skin, and the black earth rushed upward with terrifying speed. Frost counted the seconds. Then the parachute jerked open, hard and sudden, and the night filled with the flutter of silk canopies. Below, the fields of Bruneval glimmered faintly with frost. Some men landed perfectly, others drifted off course, crashing through hedgerows or colliding with stone walls. Private Cox hit the ground in a frozen ploughed field, his chute dragging behind him like a ghost. He ripped himself free and crouched low, the smell of damp soil filling his lungs. In the distance, he heard a dog barking, then another, farther away. Frost landed close to the designated drop zone, his men forming up quickly around him. The dark outline of the cliff loomed to the north. Somewhere down there, beyond the ridgeline, was the German radar station, the Würzburg dish, and the soldiers guarding it. They moved silently, weapons ready, boots sinking into the wet earth. The only sound was the wind coming off the sea, but not everyone had landed where they were supposed to. A few sticks of paratroopers were scattered to the east, their drop zones thrown off by strong crosswinds. One small group ended up perilously close to a German machine gun post. They froze as a light flickered in a nearby farmhouse. For an endless moment the night held its breath. Then, as if the world itself understood the stakes, the light went out again. By 01:30, Frost had gathered enough men to begin the advance. Ahead, the faint outline of the radar station rose like a strange metallic flower against the sky. The curved dish angled upward, catching what little moonlight slipped through the clouds. Around it, they could make out the low shapes of barracks and concrete bunkers. German voices carried faintly through the wind. "Now," Frost whispered, "they moved like shadows." The first section, led by Sergeant Vernon, cut through the outer wire with quiet precision. A dog began to bark, sharp and loud. Then a short hiss of a Sten silenced it. The air felt electric, charged with the kind of tension that precedes violence. When the first German guard appeared, cigarette glowing at his lip, the British raiders opened fire. Short bursts, controlled, efficient. The man dropped before he could shout. The camp erupted. Shouts in German, boots on gravel, the crack of rifles. The night turned violent. Frost's men surged forward, throwing grenades into the barracks, clearing rooms in seconds. The radar technicians, dazed and half-dressed, stumbled into the open and were met by paratroopers shouting for surrender. One technician raised his hands, terrified, shaking, and was immediately ordered to show where the radar's power unit was housed. As the firefight spread, a young corporal named Pritchard sprinted to the dish itself. Up close, the Würzburg. Radar looked almost alive. Wires coiled like veins, the curved metal surface gleaming with frost. Engineers from Frost's team rushed forward with tools and charges, cutting through bolts, labeling cables, dismantling the heart of the machine while gunfire crackled around them. Every minute mattered. The Germans regrouped faster than expected. From the nearby village, reinforcements began to arrive, Wehrmacht soldiers shouting orders, bullets ripping through the hedges. One of Frost's radio operators was hit, falling silently beside his set. Frost cursed under his breath but kept the line moving. They couldn't afford a stand-up fight. The objective was not to conquer, it was to steal and escape. By Otuzao, they had what they came for. Grates packed with radar components were hauled out of the control hut, slung over shoulders, dragged toward the beach path. "Move," Frost barked. "Leave the rest." Behind them, the radar station burned, not from demolition, but from the firefight itself, a chaotic bloom of sparks and flame. As they descended toward the cliffs, the sound of the sea grew louder, mingling with gunfire. The men could see the surf breaking below, but the path was treacherous, steep, narrow, littered with stones. German flares burst overhead, turning the snow to silver. Every shadow looked like death. Somewhere above them, a machine gun opened up, tracers slicing the air. The first groups reached the beach, signaling frantically with shutter lamps to the Royal Navy launches waiting offshore. Frost's men began forming a defensive line along the sand, returning fire as German soldiers appeared at the cliff edge. The smell of cordite mixed with salt and smoke. The extraction was chaos. Waves crashed against the hulls as sailors jumped out to pull the raiders aboard. Men threw the radar crates into the boats, shouting to be heard over the engines. One soldier slipped, nearly crushed between rocks and steel, but his comrades dragged him clear. Frost was among the last aboard, his uniform soaked through, his voice hoarse from shouting. As the boats pulled away from the shore, gunfire followed them. Flashes of light against the cliffs. The men crouched low, clutching their prizes, hearts pounding. The radar components, wet, heavy, priceless, lay beneath a tarp at their feet. Above them, the horizon was beginning to pale. Dawn was coming. Behind them, Bruneval burned. The boats tore through the surf like hunted animals, engines straining, spray slapping against their hulls as German bullets hissed through the darkness. The cliffs of Bruneval loomed behind them, flashing with muzzle fire, thin white streaks against the dying night. Frost crouched low in the stern, shouting orders over the roar of the motor. "Keep them moving! Don't stop for anything." His men were crammed shoulder to shoulder, their uniforms soaked, faces smeared with dirt and salt. Some clutched rifles, others the precious radar crates, boxes filled with the future of the air war. The Royal Navy crews fought the sea as fiercely as the enemy. Each wave threatened to throw the small craft off course. A few paratroopers leaned over the sides, vomiting from exhaustion and seawater, but no one dared complain. They were alive! That was miracle enough. Behind them, the cliff echoed with the fading chaos of the firefight, shouted German orders, the dull thump of mortars, the rising howl of sirens. The radar station that had guarded the coast for months was now silent, its heart torn out. As the boats reached deeper water, Frost looked back one last time. The outline of Bruneval faded into the mist, a black scar on the horizon. "That's it, lads," he muttered. They'll be talking about this one for a while. When the first launch reached the destroyer, HMS Prince Leopold, the sailors hauled the soaked paratroopers aboard with rope and brute strength. Men collapsed on the deck, laughing, coughing, crying. One of the engineers immediately knelt beside the radar crates, checking for water damage. "Still intact," he breathed, patting the damp metal casing as if it were a wounded comrade. Frost allowed himself the smallest of smiles. Against every probability, they had pulled it off. The destroyer turned toward England at full speed. The men were given mugs of tea, so hot they burned their lips, but no one complained. They huddled under blankets, shivering, eyes wide with the aftershock of adrenaline. Some fell asleep instantly, others stared at nothing, replaying the night in fragments, the hiss of a Sten gun, the sudden burst of light when the radar dish caught fire, the feel of their boots slipping on icy stone as they ran for the beach. In London, news of the raid reached the War Cabinet before dawn. Churchill was briefed over breakfast and reportedly smiled for the first time in weeks. "At last," he said, "a pinch worth the pain." The British press wouldn't hear of the operation for months, but inside the corridors of the Air Ministry, it was already legend. The intelligence teams moved quickly. Within hours of the radar component's arrival, scientists at the Telecommunications Research Establishment were poring over them. Dr. R.V. Jones himself stood in the lab as engineers carefully pried open the equipment, revealing the delicate German circuitry inside. The findings were staggering. The Würzburg radar operated at a frequency of 560 MHz, far higher and more precise than expected. Its guidance system was intricate, using mechanical synchros and fine-tuned oscillators that allowed German gunners to lock onto bombers with frightening accuracy. But now, Britain had the blueprint. Within days, the scientists began developing countermeasures, signal jammers, decoys, and new radar-reflective materials. What had been the Luftwaffe's invisible advantage was now vulnerable. For Frost and his men, the glory was quieter. They were debriefed, photographed, and congratulated, then sent back into training for the next mission. The war didn't pause to celebrate, but among them, the sense of pride was unmistakable. They had proven something not just to their commanders, but to themselves, that Britain could strike deep into occupied Europe and come back alive. The Germans, meanwhile, were furious. When they arrived at the Bruneval site at first light, they found the radar station in ruins, the dish dismantled, and several technicians missing. The surviving guards were interrogated and blamed for negligence. Heinrich Himmler reportedly demanded an inquiry, convinced that the attack had involved hundreds of men supported by naval bombardment. In reality, fewer than 120 paratroopers had achieved what entire bomber wings could not: the complete capture of a functioning radar system from under the Reich's nose. In the following weeks, the Germans scrambled to adjust their radar network, modifying frequencies and reinforcing coastal defenses. They built more concrete bunkers, installed extra guards, and tried to shield their installations with camouflage. But it was too late. The secret was out. British scientists, armed with the captured Würzburg's data, developed radar jamming operations that would later be used on a massive scale, most famously during Operation Gomorrah, the bombing of Hamburg, and the D-Day landings 2 years later. The Bruneval Pinch, as it came to be known, had tilted the balance of electronic warfare. Yet for the men who had lived it, the memory was less about triumph and more about survival. Frost would later recall that the quietest moment, the one that stayed with him, was not the firefight or the escape, but the eerie stillness before the first shot was fired, when the radar dish stood gleaming under the moon, and every man waited for the order to begin. It was, he said, like standing at the edge of the future. That future was now unfolding. With the information gained from Bruneval, British scientists designed new airborne radar and navigation aids, while the Royal Air Force began experimenting with radar counterintelligence, false echoes, chaff clouds, and frequency interference. The air war, once decided by the number of planes and bombs, was now governed by who could control the unseen. The Bruneval raid had not only stolen a machine, it had stolen time, months, perhaps years, from the enemy's technological lead. But for every operation that succeeded, dozens had failed. Across Europe, countless secret missions ended in silence. Agents captured, commandos executed, villages razed in retaliation. Bruneval's success was a rare miracle born from precision, courage, and luck. Those who survived knew it too. In the pubs and barracks back home, when talk turned to the raid, there was always a pause, a quiet acknowledgement that for every man who came back, another had almost not. When Frost's company marched again weeks later, there was no fanfare. Their next destination was North Africa, then Arnhem, where Frost would earn eternal fame and wounds, holding a bridge for longer than any sane commander would have dared. But in February 1942, before the world had heard of Arnhem or Normandy, there was only Bruneval, the night the British stole the eyes of the enemy. In the months that followed the Bruneval raid, war itself began to change shape. It was no longer just a clash of tanks and infantry, of bombs and bayonets. It had become a silent duel, fought across the airwaves, a shadow war of frequencies. Both sides now understood that whoever could control the invisible world of radar would control the skies, and by extension, the war. In the laboratories of Malvern and Bawdsey Manor, British scientists worked around the clock, dissecting every component of the stolen Würzburg radar. The machine lay in pieces on long wooden tables, its metal guts exposed like a dissected creature. The engineers studied it as if it were alive, mapping its circuits, tracing its logic, learning its rhythm. They discovered how the Germans tracked aircraft with astonishing precision, how the dish's oscillating pulse could follow a bomber formation through cloud and darkness. Then they learned how to blind it. Dr. R.V. Jones led a new initiative called Countermeasures Section. His vision was simple but revolutionary. If the enemy's radar could be deceived, entire bomber fleets could pass unseen. From this came one of the strangest and most effective inventions of the war, window. It was nothing more than strips of aluminum foil cut to specific lengths, designed to reflect radar waves. When dropped by aircraft in massive quantities, it filled German radar screens with phantom signals, hundreds of false echoes that made the sky itself unreadable. The first time window was used, during the bombing of Hamburg in 1943, the results were catastrophic for Germany. Their radar-guided flak batteries fired blindly into the night, unable to distinguish ghost from plane. Searchlights swept in useless circles. The city below burned for 8 days and nights, while German officers cursed at screens filled with static snow. The seeds of that chaos had been planted at Bruneval, but success came at a cost. Every advance in radar deception triggered a countermeasure, every countermeasure a new deception. It became an endless spiral of innovation and destruction. The Germans developed Freya and Liechtenstein radar systems, designed to detect Allied aircraft and night fighters. The British answered with Surratt, a device that homed in on the very signals those radars emitted. German pilots soon realized that by turning on their radar, they were also broadcasting their own location to the enemy. It was a nightmare of mirrors, a war fought in silence, where detection meant death. In dimly lit control rooms across Britain, young operators sat hunched over cathode ray screens, headphones pressed tight to their ears. They were the unseen soldiers of this new war, their battles fought in green flickers and ghostly hums. They listened for the faint sweep of enemy transmissions, trying to read intent from static. Every pulse, every blip, was a potential ambush, a possible clue. It was intelligence work performed in real time, where 1 second of hesitation could mean 1,000 lives lost in the skies above. The men who had stolen the Würzburg often heard nothing about these invisible victories. Most of them were sent back into combat or reassigned to new operations. Major John Frost moved on to other battles, each more brutal than the last. Yet in secret, the information they had captured continued to ripple outward through every corner of the Allied war effort. Radar was no longer just a scientific curiosity. It had become the nervous system of modern warfare. By 1944, radar covered nearly every beach, every airfield, every stretch of water in Western Europe. The Allies had radar stations that could see ships hundreds of miles away. German submarines, once deadly hunters, now found themselves hunted. Convoys moved under a protective curtain of detection, guided by radar beacons that pulsed through fog and storm. The same technology that had begun as a German advantage now served the Allies as both shield and sword. And yet, for all its brilliance, radar brought with it a strange kind of blindness. Commanders began to rely too much on screens, on the flicker of artificial vision. In the chaos of war, human eyes were often slower, but human instinct, that old animal sense of danger, still mattered. Pilots flying through radar-guided corridors sometimes crashed into clouds or each other. Ships misread signals and collided in darkness. Technology had made war faster, but not safer. By the end of the war, radar had shaped the very way humanity understood battle. The age of smoke and bugles was gone. In its place came an era of invisible waves, of unseen duels fought in silence. When peace finally came, the radar towers stood like ghosts across Europe, staring into horizons where the enemy no longer came. Dr. Jones returned to his quiet work. Haunted by what his inventions had made possible. "We learned to see without seeing," he once wrote, and that changed everything. Frost survived Arnhem and lived long enough to watch jet aircraft rise into skies once ruled by propellers. He never spoke much about Brunval, but when pressed, he would say it wasn't the firefight or the danger that stayed with him. It was the moment he first saw the radar dish up close, gleaming in the moonlight, and realized that he wasn't just stealing a machine. He was stealing the future. That night in February 1942, a handful of paratroopers and scientists altered the course of a global war, not by sheer firepower, but by intellect, by precision, by the courage to reach into the enemy's mind and pull something vital from its depths. In the end, it wasn't just a raid. It was a message. That knowledge itself could be a weapon, sharper than any blade, quieter than any bomb, and for the first time in history, humanity had glimpsed the kind of war that would define its future, not fought in trenches or skies, but in signals, in data, in the invisible. If these forgotten stories of courage, science and sacrifice speak to you, then share them. Let others hear how a handful of men, armed with nothing but conviction and precision, changed the fate of nations. Because history doesn't just remember who fought, it remembers who thought.